Okay, we're live. Are you guys ready for me to let everyone in, or? Yeah? Oh, wait, now can I not hear anyone? Wait, someone talk.
Oh yeah, can you hear
Okay,
me?
good. I was like, everyone was nodding, and I was like, this way. Okay, I'm letting everyone in. Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for a few more people to join, and then we will get on our way. Okay, I think no one else is waiting. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. First off, I need to let you know that we are going to be recording this talk. So you should turn off your video if you don't want to be in the recording. Also, if you can all mute yourself if you haven't already, that would be great. Thank you very much. I'm Marisa Johnson from Artists for Democracy. Welcome to the first talk in our Artists for Democracy Georgia Special Election edition of our talk series. I'm sure you all know that this upcoming election in Georgia is immensely important. The balance of the Senate and the ability of the next administration to govern effectively on important issues like climate change, healthcare, racial justice, and voting rights hinges on the outcome of this state election. With that in mind, A4D will be hosting 2 more artist talks before the January 5th election. The next one will be with Atlanta-based artist Bethany Collins, and we will be co-sponsoring a talk with Catherine Andrews, who has an installation up now at DePaul University. We will also be joining up with the group Phone Banking with Artists again, who will be hosting phone banking sessions every Saturday from 12 to 3. We will have specific information on that with links up on our website very shortly. And we encourage you all to join if you can. It's immensely effective in getting out the vote, and they make it super easy by training you and providing you with backup as you phone bank. In addition, we will be doing everything we can to support the organization Walk the Walk, which is fundraising for grassroots community-based organizations in Georgia that will be mobilizing voters for the January election. You can visit their website, and we'll put the link in the chat. Today, we are so happy to have artists from the exhibition Almost Presidential here to talk with us about this very timely show. Joining us are artists and co-curators of the show, Marisa Futernick and Rebecca Sittler, and participating artists Cintia Segovia and also Deborah Aschheim. Marisa and Cintia are some of our amazing, and Deborah, are some of our amazing A4D members, so this is extra exciting. If you have questions for any of them, please put them in the chat. And Deborah Aschheim, who is also in the show, like I said before, will ask them for you after the talk. After the Q&A, we will be joined by Hannah Israel, who's going to be giving us all some practical information about the upcoming election. So with that, I'm going to pass you off to Rebecca. I need to find her right there.
Hi, everybody. We're so glad to be here with you today. My name is Rebecca Sittler, and I'm one of the co-curators along with Marisa Futernick of Almost Presidential. Almost Presidential is an artist project that highlights artists whose previous bodies of work have challenged the visual and rhetorical representations of former presidents and their legacies. In the context of the 2020 US federal election, this project involves 6 artists who have made work about either vice presidents or failed presidential candidates, looking at candidates that are either forgotten to history or those who might have been reduced to one-liners or supporting roles just outside the spotlight. Though our national histories are often written with victors in mind, failed candidates have a substantial impact on intangible ideas that surround electability and how we visualize presidential power, slowly but gradually expanding the political imagination of the electorate. Additionally, the platforms and strategies of future candidates and political movements are influenced through ideas that may very gradually gain momentum and reach consensus in future elections. I'm going to pass the spotlight over to Marisa.
Thanks, Rebecca. And just to add to what Rebecca's saying about this exhibition, it's been made in the current context. The exhibition, there's some links in the chat where you can see the work from this exhibition, which was originally scheduled to take place at several museums. And because of COVID, it's moved online, and it's being presented right now online by Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa. So there's a link in the chat for that. And there's also a documentary film that OCC has made about the exhibition, and there's a link where you can watch that on YouTube. So, you know, thinking about our current context, a lot of these former candidates and these past elections might now seem rather quaint in the general sense of civility, and especially in the relatively peaceful transfer of power that we have perhaps come to take for granted in this country. And so many of us might also long for a politics that's focused on debate and a more genuine discussion of ideas and platforms, although one might argue that we've never actually really had that in American politics. But you might find yourself somewhat nostalgic for past election cycles where we sort of knew what to expect at this stage in the game. And even though disenfranchisement has always existed, there was a time when voting was largely respected by all the candidates involved as essential to our democracy. So one of the things that was really interesting for us as artists looking back on these field candidates is the way in which these histories contain small seeds that have grown into this current moment, and also offer maybe a possibility of imagining our way out of it. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot amongst each other is the fact that the losers are often very influential. Right now, we have an especially powerful loser who we're seeing perhaps more of than the winner of the election. But just in very recent history, if we think of somebody like Bernie Sanders, that's a great example of a losing candidate, a failed candidate who's actually had a pretty big impact on political discourse. So the artists in this exhibition are all exploring political rhetoric and failure and gender dynamics in different ways within political systems in the US, but also in Mexico, as Cintia is going to talk about in her work, and also in the Philippines. One of the artists who's not with us today, Pio Abad, has made work related to connection between American and Filipino presidential politics. And these works combine fiction and historical fact into an active survey of political material and text and image. So the three of us who are going to talk about our work from the show today are going to just take a few minutes to show you some images and tell you a little bit more about what we made for this exhibition. Before I start showing some of my work, actually, if Cintia wants to start doing the screen share, thank you. Great. Just briefly how we all came together as artists who can all get super nerdy talking about politics. I had a book published in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election called 13 Presidents. And as part of research for this book, I drove 10,000 miles around the country to visit all 13 of the nation's presidential libraries, which are essentially archives and museums. And the book combines several hundred photographs that I took on that journey with 13 short stories. Each story has a president from Herbert Hoover to George W. Bush as a character, and the stories are a mixture of fact and fiction. So around the same time that this book came out, Rebecca had an artist book that was published that also dealt with material from presidential libraries. And so we did a book swap with each other. And she was based in California. At the time, I was based in London. And then I moved out to California. So we met up. And not long after that, I was at the Nixon Library in Southern California, and the curator there told me about another artist who'd made work about presidents, and that was Deborah Aschheim. So when the three of us met up, it was, I guess, about maybe a year and a half ago, and we started talking about how there was another presidential election on the horizon, and it would be really great to work on an exhibition together. So that's how we found each other. And then as the exhibition developed, we invited 3 other artists to participate. So Cintia and Matthew Brannan, who's based in New York, and Pio Abad, who's based in London. And so that's the origin of the show. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work for the exhibition, the title of which is Concession. And this is an installation view of the work at the museum at UNLV, where the show was going to open before COVID happened. So the installation consists of photographs along with little text panels, and that's what those little green pieces of paper are. In each of the photographs, I'm wearing a rather crude paper face mask to assume the identity of one of a dozen different failed presidential candidates. Nearly all of them are male, from Barry Goldwater through Hillary Clinton. And so each photograph consists of the solitary figure in a different prototypical American landscape. Here we have the backyard. And then the photographs are paired with these typewritten texts. And the texts weave together quotes from actual concession speeches with fictional lines that I've invented. So starting here, they're in chronological order here. This is Barry Goldwater, who lost to Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And then we have Hubert Humphrey, who lost to Richard Nixon in 1968. And George McGovern is next, who lost to Nixon in 72. Then we have Walter Mondale, who lost to Ronald Reagan in 1984. And Michael Dukakis, who lost to Bush in 88. Bob Dole, who lost to Clinton in 1996. Al Gore is up next, who lost to George W. Bush in 2000 in another contested election result. And John Kerry, who I believe Biden has just appointed as his czar on climate, who lost to George W. Bush in 2004. And John McCain, who lost to Obama in 2008. And I'm curious how many people recognize any of these figures. Mitt Romney, who lost to Obama in 2012. And Hillary Clinton, who lost to Trump in 2016. And I think the idea for this piece started with, I don't know if people remember, but the day after Hillary lost in 2016, she was spotted walking in the woods near her house. Someone spotted her and took a picture and posted it on social media, but she was just, in her fleece jacket by herself out for a walk in the woods. And there was something really poignant about that image to me. And the idea of the morning after an election being like a hangover. I think this year is, like many things this year, was really different because we didn't have that morning after. But yeah, so this work in a way was kind of the starting point for the projects. And then the last image is, and this is just a close-up of one of the texts. So again, this is mixing quotes from the actual concession speech that Hillary gave with invented lines. And maybe I'll just briefly read it. This is painful, and it will be for a long time. This was never any child's dream. Biggest mistake I ever made. But no, Tears, blood, vomit, all at once, hyperventilation. The words come out of my mouth. I still believe in America, and I always will. Frizzy hair, melting makeup, sweat stains in my pits. Doesn't matter now. Donald Trump is going to be our president. My mother crocheting a peach baby blanket, slices of pizza, and pitchers of beer that first year of law school. No one likes a smart girl, the professor tells us. Bunions and calluses. Remember, any boy can become president unless he's got a mustache, Dewey tells the Boy Scouts. It has happened. It is done. Your hugs are not enough. So that just gives you a sense of what these little texts are like that sit alongside the photographs. And then the last one is George Wallace, who also lost to Nixon in 68. And so these are all major party candidates except for George Wallace. He unsuccessfully sought the Democratic nomination 3 times, and he also ran as a third party candidate in 1968. And that year, he actually received 13.5% of the vote, of the popular vote, and is the most recent third-party candidate to receive pledged electoral college votes from any state. And I only just learned this very recently, but in 1968, there was actually a real move to get rid of the electoral college because of this guy, because of George Wallace, because both the Democrats and the Republicans were worried that he would get enough electoral college votes that there would be a tie between the Democrats and the Republicans, and that the House of Representatives would have to choose the president. And that would give this guy Wallace a lot of power in pushing his agenda. And so the House of Representatives actually voted in 1969 to get rid of the Electoral College, but that was killed on the Senate floor by a group of Southern senators who thought that the big population states would be too dominant. But for those who are not familiar with George Wallace, he's famous, notorious for calling for, quote, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. He was the governor of Alabama, and he also ran on a campaign of law and order in 1968. And the next slide you'll see is a button from his 68 campaign. And so, of course, the echoes of that phrase are heard in Trump's 2020 campaign rhetoric this year. And what's really fascinating to me, and especially potent in the context of 2000, is that George Wallace was a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination the same year that Shirley Chisholm was a candidate for the Democratic nomination, 1972. Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress, and she was the first Black female candidate to seek a major party's nomination for president of the United States. And here you can see one of her campaign posters. And I love this photograph on the right. This is at the 1972 Democratic Convention, on the floor of the convention. And in the foreground, we have a delegate for Shirley Chisholm. And behind him, these delegates for George Wallace. And another thing that is pretty fascinating is Wallace was shot at point blank range on the campaign trail that year in an assassination attempt. And Shirley Chisholm visited him in the hospital, and she was really criticized in the media for that gesture. He was, even at the time, he was notorious racist. And Shirley Chisholm said that she believed that in a democracy, it was important to respect your opponents. And the alternative, she said, would be to, quote, encourage the same sickness in public life that leads to assassinations. So I find myself really drawn to this moment in political history and what that can tell us about 2000, about what we're going through right now. So I am going to pass over to Rebecca, who is going to share with us the work that she's made for this exhibition.
All right, hi everybody. So I chose to focus on Walter Mondale's failed candidacy for the presidency. And this series of photographs is called Fritz, Fragments from an Imagined Presidential Museum for Walter F. Mondale. And it includes images that are constructed still lives that explore Mondale's failed presidential candidacy, while also suggesting that his candidacy really changed the way that we think about the presidency and about presidential campaigns. The images follow a book that I published in 2014, which is called All the President's Men. And this book combined images that are made in presidential museums across the US with photographs from my father and my grandfather's homes. The book block, as you can see here, is surrounded by a large panoramic image that opens to reveal replicas of objects from my dad's memory box, and a story that he often told me about a chance meeting with former President Harry Truman walking the streets of Independence, Missouri, after he took an all-night road trip with a friend when he was 18 years old. And I started this particular project on presidential museums because I was fascinated with the Nixon Museum in particular, and the way that it fused the domestic, the political, and the nostalgic, as well as the museum's attempts at balancing representations of Nixon's very public failures, while also trying to elicit empathy from visitors. So here, the image on the right is from the, actually, I don't think this display exists any longer, but from around 2014 at the Nixon Museum on the right. And then the image on the left was actually taken on my grandparents' mantelpiece. So the two images are of my grandfather, who served in World War II as a glider pilot. So the book in the series really look at particular ways that these mythologies surrounding masculinity get replicated, even when they might not reflect the people that they depict. To make these artificial museum displays, I make paper replicas of objects and ephemera, and I arrange them in constructed dioramas in the studio. This image in particular is made of these kind of historical signs that I found just doing research on this sort of time in history, and looking at both the vice presidential run of Walter Mondale from '76, as well as his presidential run in '84. Some of the signs I actually had to recreate and then photograph myself holding them up to get these cutouts to kind of work together. But they're constructed basically and sort of assembled in a kind of a studio diorama in the studio. So they're actually physically cut out and then placed on top of an image that I made in the National Park Service's museum for Carter, where basically you could go and sit behind the Resolute desk, and there's this really wonderful, really pixelated backdrop that you can have a selfie made in front of while you pretend to be president. So the next slide here. So I was really drawn to exploring Walter Mondale as a political figure for several reasons. I was drawn for his respect for and ability to see the value of supporting roles. So he expanded the role of the vice president during the Carter administration, and he allowed Geraldine Ferraro, his VP pick, to play a very major role in his campaign for the presidency. In the series, I play with very similar elements of nostalgia, collage, and fusions of the domestic and the political that I saw in a lot of the presidential museums that I visited. I also use scale, repetition, cropping, or I sometimes highlight strange details to ask the viewer to look at a familiar representation in a new way. And I was also drawn to looking at the visual and the rhetorical devices that are designed to communicate particular subtleties of changing notions of Midwestern masculinity, and thinking about how this might have affected the campaign. So I love this sort of like typical large family dinner with the microphones placed on the table, and kind of thinking about this kind of common kind of like shtick of the kind of visual rhetoric of the presidency. I spoke to a couple of people who worked in the presidential museums along the way, and I think when I was at Eisenhower's museum, there was someone who said, "Well, you've been to all the other presidential museums. They're quite similar, actually. So you've probably seen a lot of these kinds of things before." And I think there is, something to kind of the way in which we like to see kind of our presidential figures. And I'm kind of curious about the way that that sort of subtly shifts and changes over time. I'm also, for perhaps obvious reasons, I was drawn to looking at Mondale's challenge of facing a very populist incumbent. He was up against Reagan in 1984 when Reagan was running for his second term. And for this image, I was also thinking about a book by Jackson Katz called Leading Men that proposes that most presidential races are shaped by and are a referendum on competing forms of masculinity. So while you might not think that, let's say, a presidential race between two men, between, let's say, Reagan and Mondale, might not be about gender, but actually Katz's book really explores a way in which our presidential sort of electoral history largely hinges on these kind of questions that surround masculinity and kind of cultural conceptions of masculinity at the time. And last but not least, I was also drawn, probably for obvious reasons, to Mondale's support of women and the Equal Rights Amendment. He chose a female running mate in 1984. Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman to be chosen as a vice presidential candidate by a major party. And now it looks like we finally have a female VP and Kamala Harris, which is very exciting. And also I was really interested looking at a lot of the kind of campaign imagery at the way in which during Mondale's campaign, they really kind of flipped the usual kind of placement of the vice presidential candidate. Oftentimes that the VP had to sort of stand behind the presidential candidate. But really in 1984, and in a lot of these images, you see Ferraro kind of standing in front of Mondale. Because I think he really understood that regardless of the outcome, that this would be a historic election. So even though he lost the 1984 election, he really did help to expand our notions of what a president and a vice president could be. And while in hindsight, these shifts may be subtle, perhaps even frustratingly subtle, they lead to much larger seismic shifts in our political landscape in years to come. So a big part of this kind of project is that a lot of us really like to nerd out on political ephemera. So we all selected some ephemera from candidates that are perhaps related to kind of bigger questions that we're interested in exploring or related to the candidate that we chose to make work about for the show. So for me, some of the major themes that my work surrounds really deal with history and gender and politics. So these are ephemera from campaigns of failed female presidential candidates. Oftentimes they are third-party candidates, though you also see quite a few buttons here, of course, there's Hillary Clinton, and a variety of Shirley Chisholm, who we spoke about before. Some of these third-party candidates like Sonia Johnson, Lenora Falani, and probably my favorite, the one that I'll talk about is Margaret Wright, who has this kind of large pamphlet that's in this grouping here on this slide. And I also just would say that I have a lot of previous projects that deal with unconventional navigations of gendered roles, and that also look at history and archives for examples that might sort of be outside of the kind of typical or expected way of seeing those roles. So Margaret Wright was a candidate for the presidency in 1976. She was part of the People's Party. She was a community organizer in Los Angeles and Watts and was known as Grandma Margaret. She had a platform of social programs. She was running on redistribution of land and wealth and free healthcare. Her running mate was Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was a well-known American pediatrician. And when she got involved in politics, when she went to work for Lockheed during the war, and she was a Rosie the Riveter, and she became involved in the union through Lockheed and just began to be very interested in kind of political organizing. She gained a reputation as a smart community organizer, and she was a fierce civil rights activist. She founded a group called Women Against Racism, or WAR, and she worked for the United Parents Council of Watts and organized several crucial protests that help to establish African American studies programs and also to improve recruitment of minority students and advocate for more diverse hiring practices for local high schools. All right, and there's a lot of great candidates here too, and some unique candidates that are good to kind of learn a little bit more about. I'm going to go ahead and pass on the spotlight now to Cynthia.
Thank you. Oh, let me fix this. Okay, good. Okay, hi everyone. So the work that I did for this exhibition is based on Margarita Zavala de Calderón, and she ran for president in Mexico in between 2017 and 18. And Mexico is where I was born and raised, and she is a wife of former President Calderón, who was in power from 2006 to 2012. They met in law school and were an incredible influential couple in the party PAN that brought him to power. So the problem is that his administration unleashed a war on drugs by taking the military forces to the streets. This strategy was not effective and in fact led to thousands of civilian deaths, and the power of the drug lords has only increased since then. Another criticism was that his alleged alcoholism. And 4 years after her husband left power, Margarita Zavala tried to run for president for the same party. Her gender and the legacy of her husband were the focal points, since she was criticized for the mistakes of her husband, and every time she would deflect with a smile. She never allowed herself to appear angry. So this aspect of her campaign was interesting for me, since the male candidates were allowed to be bold and bombastic. All these, like, this is a parallel universe where we are living in. She was forced out of the party after the leadership supported someone else. So she ran as an independent candidate with no money from the electoral system and a diminished political base. Even though I don't agree with her political agenda, watching her interviews, mostly led by male panelists, made me wonder, how could she continue fighting, and what kind of advice was she getting from her political campaign? I created another character, a shaman, who is the only one that is capable of advising her and telling the candidate the truth. Through jokes and irony, this character reveals aspects of the machista society that still doesn't take a female candidate as a serious option. The shaman presents a complete makeover of her campaign, where she can be strong, independent, and prescribes magic potions, amulets for her to leave her husband, who casts so much shadow on her, and rituals to free herself from caring about the criticisms as a solution for her campaign problems. So now I would like to show you a couple of minutes of this video. Esperar más. Nuestro momento de contribuir con el futuro del país es hoy. Los ciudadanos están cansados de corrupción, de instituciones que solo les responden a unos pocos. Mucha gente se ha acercado a mí con la preocupación de que las cosas no van a cambiar, pero juntos vamos a cambiar al país. ¿Te cae? A ver, ese lenguaje de politiquería ni me gusta, y si te puedo ser sincera, la verdad es que no me interesa saber más de lo que quieres y sin tapujos. Saber en lo que te puedo ayudar. A mí me estás pagando como tu guía. Entonces, de esa misma manera como en los United States tienen gurús budistas. Así que vamos a ser muy honestas y vamos a ver fuera la política. Vamos a ver, hablamos a la boca de cántaro. He visto tus mítines y sí tienes mucha cola que te pisen, comadre. También tienes muchas inconsistencias en tu discurso. O a ver, ¿cómo le llaman eso en tus círculos?
Yes, Room of Opportunity. Vamos a empezar, ¿ok? A ver, vamos a ver este segmento. Dale play. Yo sé de discriminación, de no ser escuchada por ser mujer, de que no se me dé la palabra en público y de ser considerada como la propiedad de otra persona, de asumir que no tengo una opinión. Las causas de las mexicanas y los mexicanos son mis causas. Mira, como esto tiene que funcionar, es que yo soy como un tótem, como un vessel de tu spiritual power. Así que vamos a hacerte una mejor candidata, la mejor candidata del siglo XXI. Para empezar, vamos a darte esta corona para que sepas que eres una reina, princesa católica, apostólica y remona, una reina. En los siguientes meses estaremos tocando puertas, hablando con los ciudadanos y pidiéndoles sus firmas. Estas firmas no son solo una rúbrica, son un voto de confianza por un nuevo México, con el México que todos queremos ver y que es posible con la participación de todos, de manera democrática y libre. Eres como la canción, ella es como el sol, él es como la luna. Ah, no, esa era otra. Pero mira, el punto es que tenemos que limpiarte todo eso, de esa mala vibra de tu esposo. Tenemos que limpiártelo así, hasta con hacks, para que quedes rechinando de limpio, con el pinche karma que te cargas. Mira, hasta te voy a regalar, no te voy a cobrar, te voy a regalar estos, para que puedas ponerlos en tu altar. Y mira, así te voy a dejar un menjurje para que si alguna vez decides mandar al Felipillo al más allá, entonces...
Oh, sorry. Wrong button. Okay, here we were. So that was the video. And now I would like to talk to you about my piece of ephemera, the candidate that really inspired me. This is a poster from another female candidate that ran at the same time, but didn't obtain enough signatures to qualify to officially run for president. Maria de Jesus Patricio Martinez, or Marichuy as she is known, comes from an indigenous community in the north of the country. She practices traditional medicine as well as herb medicine. Since 1994, when the indigenous group the Zapatistas in the south of Mexico stood up in arms, she started to participate in the conferences to become a political leader. She represents an anti-capitalist agenda in favor of sustainable development of the natural resources in Mexico and respect the autonomy of the indigenous communities. Her campaign rejected financial support from the electoral body. It is speculated that she might have obtained the necessary signatures to run as an official candidate. Has it not been for the fact that the signatures were required to be collected electronically in a country where more than 60% of the population lives in poverty and many do not have access to the internet? She believes that society must organize itself if it wants to transform the country, and that these ideals represent thousands and thousands of Mexicans. So thank you. And now I'm going to pass it to Deborah, who then is another artist in the show. And Deborah will help us to do also the Q&A. And I'll add everyone. And you.
Yeah, so please, people put questions in the chat if you want to know more about either of these artist projects or the show in general or any of the candidates that we're talking about. But since I don't see any questions yet, I'm going to ask you guys a question. So I want to shift this back to Georgia. So one of the things that's very interesting to me about the idea of the show, the ideas you guys were talking about, and also participating in it myself, was thinking of failed candidates not just as a footnote to history, but the way that they actually have an influence that's maybe like different than the kind of influence that you can have when you form a coalition that involves compromise and become, is the one that gets elected. And so I'm particularly thinking about this in terms of Georgia, because right now we have John Ossoff running for Senate, who was a failed candidate for Congress in 2018 and has risen from the ashes of that to be a really credible Senate candidate. And then also the enormous importance in Georgia of another failed candidate, who I'm going to say, right? Stacey Abrams, right?
Stacey.
So you guys want to talk about that a little bit? Because that's what I was thinking about a lot while you were talking. I guess either one of you can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, Stacey Abrams is such a great example of someone who runs for office and loses and very quickly goes on to have a really big impact, potentially a greater impact than she might have had if she had been elected governor of Georgia, by putting all of this work into grassroots efforts to get out the vote and have a real impact on what's happened in the election nationally. I mean, I think with these failed candidates, there's a real spectrum of like more obvious spheres of influence, like with someone like Stacey Abrams, and then maybe more subtle spheres of influence. And we think about like Shirley Chisholm again and Kamala Harris this year. And is there like a direct lineage going back from 1972 to now? And then there's the impact on what the agenda is, what issues are important, how those issues are being addressed, and how we talk about them, and the way that Bernie Sanders has really pushed the way that we talk about Medicare for all or free college education, or a lot of the things that were really key to what his platform was.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the exciting things for me to think about is just the way in which we've gradually kind of expanded our political imaginary, and how even kind of failed candidates play a huge role in that, right? They introduce things that maybe take a while and sort of very gradually gain momentum over large periods of time. But we see some things kind of coming back around and kind of replaying, and I think, I mean, certainly I can speak probably a little bit less to Georgia, but I do feel that like we also have a lot to think about right now in terms of what it means to lose an election and the kind of proper kind of response to that. So what might kind of engage a set of ideas in the long run is perhaps to lose gracefully rather than to lose stubbornly. Or to, I think Abrams is really someone who, took a particular sort of moment and even an awareness of who she was and kind of turned that around for others, kind of found a way to kind of make the most of the situation and to engage organizers and engage individuals on the ground. And I think that's an inspiration that I am hoping will affect future elections as well. And these runoff elections for sure.
And I think what is really inspiring with the Stacey Abrams example is that if you support a candidate who loses, if you vote for them, if you volunteer for them, if you donate money to them, it doesn't mean that was all a big waste of your time or your effort, because that's not necessarily the end of the story.
Great. Okay. Well, since people are being shy, another question I wanted to ask you guys. I was thinking about this. This is kind of like, because I know about it from being on the inside. So this exhibition was originally planned as a series of 3 exhibitions, and one was going to be at the Barrick Museum at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I know you guys even drove out and started installing it, and that was cut short by the pandemic, and it was going to maybe be at another school in Los Angeles area, and then finally the last exhibition at Orange Coast College was shifted to virtual. So I know that a lot of the physical logistics of the way to present this artwork shifted a lot of times because of the particular moment we find ourselves in. But I also have been thinking a lot about how the content and the meaning of the projects changed since they were conceived originally before the pandemic, before George Floyd, before all of the really chaotic and unprecedented things that happened this year. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about how your projects might have changed for you, or the artists that you researched, the candidates that you researched, as the context for the exhibition changed as well as the venues?
Yeah, I think that's a great that's a great question. Because as you know, we had a lot of conversations about this, especially as we were kind of moving toward the election season. I think even over the summer, we just kind of started to think, there's something missing here, in the kind of work that we had all done by picking these kind of major party candidates. And I think what maybe had started out as a kind of interest in exploring kind of the underbelly of really one of the most powerful kind of positions in the United States, which is the presidency. Sort of started out as it's kind of exploring the kind of underbelly of that, or sort of which I think initially was sort of wrapped in a lot of kind of humor and pathos and a lot of kind of questions that we had about kind of failure and what it means to fail. I think many of us started thinking very differently as we were watching the election season just kind of gain momentum. And so we started talking about these other candidates and kind of contextualizing some of the work with the ephemera. And I think that was kind of a big shift as we were kind of thinking about what the show might have to offer, let's say, potential voters or people who really had like this election season on their mind. And how we wanted to make the show kind of engage with a broader kind of history of candidates and of failed candidates, and really show the kind of importance and the kind of gradual kind of momentum that failed candidates can bring. I don't know, Marisa, or Cintia, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I think for me it was very exciting to think about the Marichui as a candidate, because even though she was not officially a candidate for presidency, it really speaks about this, as Rebecca was saying, the underbelly of the inspiring figures and all the agenda that is underserved in every country about Native people, and how they have totally different views of the world and what and very progressive agenda in her case, and how we have really pushed them aside because our electoral system is messed up, and as Marisa touched on before, maybe the electoral system is it's not what we need today. And so this was like really a good opportunity to think about all these options, what is possible, and turn I saw in the chat this question about the failed candidates, to really like change the perspective on that and really think about how they are actually offering opportunities to introduce very interesting agenda in the political system.
So I'll ask the question that Cynthia was referring to. We have a question from the chat. I'm curious if the process of making this exhibit, if any of you redefined failure or its significance as part of the creative and political process.
Deborah? Not to put you on the spot, but
yeah, I know. I'm trying to think if I think I have to think about it more, honestly. It's an idea I've been wrestling with a lot lately, trying to get beyond just this idea of looking for silver linings of all these things that are canceled, all these projects that can't move forwards, all these, so like for me, I know just in terms of the exhibition, initially there was a lot of a sense of just feeling frustrated. In the creative process, I guess I'm rediscovering the idea that not necessarily having the pressure of an exhibition can give you a chance to think more deeply about what a project might mean instead of what you initially proposed and following down this linear path to like illustrate or explicate or materialize your previous idea. So that seems very interesting to me. In terms of the political process, I feel like I'm still so in the middle of it. Today's the first day that I really had a clear sense of that the person who succeeded and the person who failed were going to play out in the
Swap
right
places.
way. Yeah. And so I feel like I'm just only even being able to catch my breath again. What about you guys? Do you have a different relationship to the idea of failure from this project?
I would say for it's hard to kind of conflate the creative process and the political process for me personally. I feel like they're in some ways very different things. Even making art about politics isn't always necessarily sometimes isn't necessarily a political statement, strangely enough. And so, you know, I would say that like, so, I mean, certainly like being a professor of art, I talk a lot about failure because I think artists need to know that failure is a huge part of the artistic process, and that kind of constantly giving yourself permission to fail and to try difficult things is hugely important. But I also think like there's something about, I think there is something that I kind of keep going back to about this kind of connection between kind of the imaginary in both spheres, so both in the creative process and the political process. Kind of this idea of kind of putting something out into the world so that it exists and it can accumulate both kind of interest and engagement and coalitions and so that idea can kind of develop in the world. And I think in many ways the creative process is very similar, right? Is that you put these things out into the world and sometimes certain things catch and you know you find kind of community and consensus building with other artists about a set of ideas. And it really kind of, it can start with an individual action that then kind of builds to a kind of collective.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Well, we have time for one more question, and then we can go to Hannah, who'll talk to us a little bit about the election in Georgia. And it was a question from Marisa, but as I read it, I realized it applies to all three of you. So we got a question about, can you talk about inserting your body into the representation of the failed president or failed candidate or president's body? And I realized that all three of you guys, you put either things from your autobiography or your physical body into the work that you made for Almost Presidential. So, so that seems like a really interesting question. Also, considering that you're all three women, and we often talk about like women's relationship to the body differently than the male bodies that we're talking about in a lot of the cases. Or Cynthia bringing gender into it. So, if you guys want to talk just quickly about that, and then I guess we'll wrap up and go to Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just like very literally with my piece with Concession, you know, it's my body. I'm wearing my own clothes. I did think about what clothes I wore for each of those photo shoots, but they're my clothes. You can see in some of them, you could see my rings, my nail polish. Like I'm not really hiding my gender, which I think makes them like a little bit unsettling and also kind of really funny. But I like the idea of this really simple gesture of putting this flat piece of paper on my face to become these big public figures. And I think in my book 13 Presidents, I was really searching for voice of these presidents and trying to see them as human beings, these figures, and that as a way to relate to big politics and big history and big ideas. For me as one individual is to try to get into their heads or have some sense of their voice, or with this work to like literally take on their being. And with the text panels that sit alongside the photographs, it is kind of again trying to get into their heads and think about their voices. But of course, I'm also like making it up. So it's my invented idea of who they are as human beings.
Yeah. Cynthia, do you want to go next?
I think that for me, the performing it it always starts by drawing from an actual person, or actually something that like gets me so mad. So I had some pieces that talk about Trump, just because I process my emotions and my anger through like making these performances. And there is always, like as Marisa said, something autobiographical about it. And as with this specific candidate, since I didn't agree with her agenda to start with, it was like, for me, it was hard, but then, so it was easy to make the humor part of it. But then the more I try to understand why she was doing that, as Marisa said, like kind of like imagining like what is going through her head, I started to draw empathy, and I learned so much from that. For the parts with humor, for me is like, I think like Rebecca or someone else said at some point to me that I should like just push the work always like to the point of failure. So then it's easier to backtrack from that. But if you don't reach that point, and I think, Deborah, you were also talking about that, like if you don't really reach that point of being liberated from the little guidelines that you put yourself for a proposed project, then you're not going to make it as interesting as it could be.
Yeah. And you know, I would say that oddly enough, I before I think working on for the first presidential project that I did, I wasn't particularly kind of engaged with history, but I had this very strange sort of experience in the Nixon Museum where I was encountering a few exhibitions, and they kept just kind of like sparking sort of nostalgic memories of my grandparents' house. And I thought, well, what an odd sort of experience to have in a museum. And then I think at the time too, I was kind of thinking about looking at these kind of museum displays and trying to kind of shift them or look at them from a kind of feminist perspective or from a personal perspective on my own sort of experiences with kind of masculinities. So I grew up in the Midwest, I grew up in Nebraska, and in many ways for me, because of the story that my dad had about meeting Harry Truman after, as he says, tipping a few brewskis and taking an all-night road trip to Independence, Missouri, I was also kind of conflating these spaces as a space to explore masculinity, and also a space to kind of try to learn to understand my dad's worldview. So for me, it really kind of came from those kind of multiple angles of kind of thinking about trying to kind of like learn more about my dad by kind of going around in this sort of strange roundabout way, by looking at presidential museums, by looking at this sort of visual sort of rhetoric of the things that I sort of thought that he kind of idealized, and then trying to kind of like work my way through and kind of find some openings there, find some subtle shifts that could expand some of those ideas or notions, and could kind of explore maybe different sides of these masculinities, maybe things that haven't been seen or haven't been foregrounded as much in these displays. So I think it's you know, sometimes maybe less about my own body in the space, but sort of this idea of kind of photography offering a variety of different perspectives of a single thing.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think you guys have such interesting practices. You take such different approaches to bringing together research in archives and the political situation outside of your personal lives, and then your own subjective world. So thank you so much for sharing some of the ideas behind the show. And everybody, please go to the website to get information about the upcoming lectures. If you want to sign up, we'll send you reminders. And I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, who somehow I'm not able to spotlight, but I'm going to ask her to unmute.
I'm here. Yep,
Okay,
I'm
great.
here. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for, doing this, and all eyes are on Georgia right now. And for Rebecca, Cynthia, Marisa, for sharing your work, really incredible dialogue, and bringing up some really good points about historical, language and dialogue about failure, and the way that it could the way that it could work in our benefit. And I really like the discussion about Stacey Abrams as well, that your input on that. She's been a force, especially with this election for Georgia, which I never thought that would turn blue while I'm living here in Georgia. So that was a remarkable historical event for all of us. I just want to go over a couple of things I was asked for, and about the election coming up. There's several important dates that is looming with us Georgians, and I hope that you guys are going to go out there to vote, which is the date for the federal, state, and local races is January 5th. And the deadline to register is December 7th. Early voting begins December 14th, and I'll talk about where those early votings are in your local areas. So, one thing that's really important right now is the key point would be, Georgia voters will need to determine which party controls the U.S. Senate in January. For the runoff election, Republican Senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler face competitive challenges from Democrat John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, respectively. So Democrats also need to flip both seats to have unified control over of the White House and Congress. So this is a really, really important election for all of us. If you haven't registered yet, make sure that December 7th is the deadline that you can register. And if you need information for that, you can go through the Secretary of State's office website under Georgia, and I'll share that with you. I think it's georgia.gov. As in any type of registration, you are going to need a valid Georgia driver's license. And if you don't have those things, you can also ask for a form to get in lieu of your driver's license, to complete a Georgia register voters form, but using your Social Security. Of course, you have to be at least 18 years old, and you can register once you hit 17. I don't think that any of our students are that young in here. The other way is also to request an absentee ballot, which began in November 5th. For this, and voters who use absentee ballots in November's election do not have to use that option again. But for Georgians who are 65 and older, and for residents out of the country who previously requested an absentee ballot, one will be automatically mailed to them for the runoff. If you haven't received that ballot, you can request after November 20. Which is passed. And after a request has been submitted, Georgians should contact their local election officials. All absentee ballot must arrive by the 7 p.m. on January 5th, 2021 to be counted. If you are interested, do you think I can share my screen? Is that a possibility? Let me see. I just want to highlight a couple of things here. And this website will give you an information about where you can find, I have so many things open right now. And for absentee ballot, but you can also, hold on a sec, I got the wrong one here. Sorry, trying to find this one. I think it's the one I want. If we can get this in this, yeah, for your absentee ballot, if you are, you can go into this website, georgia.gov, and to vote for absentee ballot. This is a good site also to find out where you can find your local locations where to vote, especially when they did do the early voting in Muskogee County and all the counties in the area where you're at. Mainly the ones that I see here in attendance are the ones in Muskogee County. So do you guys have any questions? For Muskogee County, they have it down. The first voting is in by the library, the Chattahoochee Valley Library at the government building. That is one of the early voting locations we have. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Am I supposed to close this?
Well, I can say thank you so much. It's wonderful having you here as a visitor, and thank you so much, all of the students that you brought. As you said, all eyes are on Georgia. We appreciate you guys. We care about you having excellent representation that fights for your state as much as we're hoping to have Georgia voices representing the diverse communities of Georgia in the Senate. So and I just want to say one thing. I know people sometimes get frustrated or confused by the Electoral College. It is a strange institution and flawed in many ways, but the state races are popular vote. It's direct representation. Your vote could literally be one of a few hundred or 1,000 votes that determine the status of this race. So a lot of times, I know that a lot of people turn out for the presidential race and they sometimes don't come to these like smaller races, but that's exactly backwards from how important your vote is, because instead of a winner take all system like we have for the president, these races will come down to every single vote being counted. They look very close and your vote really, really matters.
Well, the other thing too that is going to affect this is the COVID rise in Georgia. The numbers are rising. So I do encourage you, if you have older family that you could encourage to go out, please encourage them to send in or, ask for the absentee ballot. That's going to be very, very crucial at this stage as we're changing the climate of COVID in especially in local rural areas in the state. So also, Deborah, can you talk about the other upcoming event again? I know that some of the other students filtered in late.
Yeah, I'm going to hand it back to Kaisa because she has more information, if that's cool, if you don't mind, Kaisa. Are you there?
Oh yeah, hi,
Okay.
Can you see me?
Hi, sorry.
Hi, no, that's okay.
I thought that might be really important for them, especially if they want to continue, joining in this program.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to have 2 more talks. We're waiting to figure out whether the Bethany Collins talk is going to be the 7th or the 9th, but the talk that we're co-sponsoring with Catherine Andrews that also deals with the history of women in presidential races is going to be December 8th. So we are going to have all of that information up on our website, which is artists4 with the number 4 democracy.com. And we'll literally know about the Bethany Collins date in tomorrow probably. And then we've reached out to some other exciting artists that have roots in Georgia or are based in Georgia to do our final talk, which will be closer to the election. So yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Is that enough info?
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of you for doing this. And lastly, I just want to mention to the students who came in late or who have not shared their information with their faculty who's also here, that they're getting credits for. Please make sure that you either share your through the chat room who you are to your Professor Reese, who's here, and I know that there's a couple of you, but then I recognize some of our students that's from the Department of Arts. So I really I thank all of you for doing this.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Hannah, so much. And thanks to all the artists. It was a really fantastic talk and really inspirational. So we hope you all come back for our next few talks. And yeah, well, good night, everyone.
Good night.